Cameron Lockwood was someone many would call a success story. At 28, he had reached significant heights in his career as a software engineer. His technical mind and calm, collected demeanor made him a sought-after expert at a high-tech development firm in Indianapolis. Yet despite his professional success, Cameron's personal life remained empty and lonely. That March evening, Cameron had no idea his life was about to change. He had been invited to a tech conference, and as is often the case, a casual dinner with colleagues followed the official part. It was there, among the lively crowd, that his attention was drawn to Lila Street. Claire. She stood out among the rest. Her dazzling smile and confidence in every move were immediately noticeable. Lila was a bit older, 31 years old, and she had already found her niche in life, holding a senior position at a large company. Her effortless confidence instantly attracted Cameron. Lila wasn't like the typical women Cameron had dated. Her ability to strike up a conversation, her humor and wit left a lasting impression on him. They spent the entire evening together, discussing not only work, but also their dreams and interests. Cameron, usually reserved, found himself talking to Lila as if she were an old friend. She was the first woman with whom he felt a sense of ease and a natural connection. Just a month after they met, Cameron and Lila started dating. Their meetings were filled with excitement, passion, and the sense that they had found something more in each other than just love. Cameron felt that Lila understood him in a way no one else did. They traveled around the Indianapolis area, visited museums and parks, and spent evenings discussing films and books. Lila's inner world was as deep as her outer charm. She could be witty and fun, yet also mysterious and complex. Lila kept her personal struggles under control. Cameron felt like he knew everything about her, but sometimes, especially when it came to her past, she would deflect or change the subject with a joke. Cameron didn't think much of it, captivated by the energy Lila brought into his life. 3 months into their relationship, Cameron made the first big move. He invited Lila to move in with him. Cameron's home in the quiet suburbs of Indianapolis was his sanctuary, a place where he could focus on work and unwind from the city's hustle and bustle. Lila agreed, and from that moment, their relationship grew even closer. Life with Lila was full of bright moments. She loved cooking dinners, they hosted house parties for close friends, and they dreamed about their future together. However, as the wedding approached, Lila's behavior began to change slightly. She became more tense at times, occasionally retreating into herself, though Cameron tried not to notice. He was in love and ready to make Lila his wife. Just 6 months after they met, Cameron proposed to Lila at one of their favorite spots, by the lake in a park near their home. It was a warm evening when Lila, standing under an old oak tree, saw Cameron drop to one knee and pull out a ring. Lila said yes, her eyes shining with joy, and at that moment, their life seemed perfect. The wedding took place just a few weeks after their engagement. It was a small but elegant ceremony with only close friends and family. Lila looked stunning in a simple yet elegant dress. There was a quiet confidence in her eyes, but only Cameron knew how nervous she had been before the ceremony. He thought it was just pre-wedding jitters. Life after the wedding seemed like paradise. Their small home was filled with laughter, dreams about the future, and conversations about children. Cameron was at the peak of happiness, feeling every day that he had finally found his true other half. Despite her rare moments of introspection, Lila remained that source of light that had burst into his life just a few months ago. Yet beneath this perfect surface, shadows were lurking that Cameron had yet to see. The summer of 2012 became a turning point for Cameron. Right after the wedding, he noticed changes in Lila's behavior. In the first weeks after the wedding, their life was almost idyllic. Long evenings in their cozy home, talks about the future and dreams. But slowly, he began to notice something strange. Lila often isolated herself, hesitated with her answers, and avoided topics related to her past. When Cameron gently tried to ask about her childhood or past relationships, Lila skillfully changed the subject or smiled it off with a joke. While these moments stirred a slight concern in Cameron, he didn't want to dwell on them, believing that time would reveal everything. One of the first red flags was the phone calls. Throughout the summer, Lila began receiving strange calls on her cell phone. Whenever Cameron was nearby, Layla would fall silent or leave the room, saying it was just work colleagues. Cameron tried not to read too much into it, but noticed that after these conversations, Layla would become distant and lost in thought. Her mood could shift suddenly, from cheerful and energetic to withdrawn and quiet. Outwardly, it seemed like typical mood swings, but they happened too frequently to go unnoticed. By mid-July, the situation worsened. Cameron began to notice that Layla was spending more time away from home, sometimes without explanation. She said it was work-related, that she often had to meet with clients or attend projects that required her presence. However, when Cameron tried to learn more about her work or meetings, Layla quickly shut down the conversation. She became more irritable, especially when Cameron tried to touch on her past. It was as if an invisible wall would rise between them every time the conversation drifted to that subject. At this point, Cameron started to suspect that Layla was hiding something, though he didn't know what. He tried to trust her, believing that his love for her was genuine and deep, but his concern grew with each passing day. Cameron also began noticing another detail. Layla often locked herself in the bathroom for long hours, especially in the mornings. When he tried to check if she was okay, she would respond briefly, clearly not wanting to discuss it. In early August, Cameron noticed another alarming sign. Unfamiliar calls began coming to their home phone. The person on the other end would immediately hang up whenever Cameron answered. But when Layla picked up, she would walk into another room, speaking softly and briefly, as if someone was monitoring her every word. Cameron tried asking her who was calling, but Layla would respond that it was just old friends she didn't want to elaborate on. Meanwhile, Layla was sinking deeper into her inner fears. Memories of the days when she started her journey of transformation kept flashing in her mind. Waves of pain, alienation, and fear returned to her life, as if these experiences were not part of the past, but her present. Layla often thought about the moments when she decided to transition, undergo surgeries, and embrace her true self. These memories haunted her, as the world she had built on love could crumble at any moment if Cameron learned the truth. One night, Layla woke up in a cold sweat, gripped by panic. In her dreams, she had once again seen scenes from her past, the moments before she started her transition, when society didn't accept her and internal fears followed her every step. Waking up, Layla found Cameron peacefully sleeping next to her. She looked at him, knowing his love was real, but she wondered how long would it last if he knew her truth. By the end of the summer, Layla had become even more withdrawn. She tried to maintain the illusion of a normal life for Cameron, but inside, a real battle was raging. At times, she looked at Cameron with sadness, as if saying goodbye to what they had. Her fears intensified, especially when the blackmail from Randall, an old acquaintance, became more aggressive. She tried to deal with it on her own, without involving Cameron, hoping she could solve the issue before her world completely fell apart. Cameron began noticing another change. Layla was avoiding physical intimacy. The passionate and tender moments they once shared became rare. She always found excuses: fatigue, work, stress. This only heightened his concern. Cameron felt that their relationship, once so close and warm, was gradually cooling, though he couldn't understand why. This was the summer when the shadows of Layla's past began to rapidly invade her life, with Randall Smith playing a key role. He was a person she had known much longer than she cared to remember. Their connection started long before her transition, when Layla lived a different life and went by a different name. Randall had been involved in illegal activities, and Layla, under the pressure of circumstances, had been entangled in them. These were dangerous times when every day was filled with fear of exposure and potential consequences. She had thought she left it all behind when she changed her life. However, in August 2012, Randall reappeared in her life, now becoming her worst nightmare. At first, it was phone calls from unknown numbers, which she ignored, hoping he would disappear as suddenly as he had returned. But then, he escalated to personal meetings. One day, Layla received a message with the address of an abandoned cafe on the outskirts of Indianapolis. Under the threat of exposure, Layla saw no choice but to attend the meeting. When Layla arrived at the meeting, her heart was pounding. Deep down, she knew no good would come of it. The abandoned cafe, with its crumbling walls and graffiti-covered surfaces, created a sinister atmosphere. When she entered, Randall was already waiting for her, sitting at one of the old tables, his face hard and his eyes cold with calculation. Lila instantly realized that his plans for her went far beyond simple blackmail. He knew too much about her past, not only about her transition, but also about what they had been involved in together before. "I know you're trying to leave it all behind," Randall said, his voice low and threatening. "But the past isn't something you can just toss away, Lila." He pulled a thin piece of paper from his pocket and carefully placed it on the table in front of Lila. It was a bank statement, and the amount on it made her flinch. $50,000. Randall was demanding money in exchange for his silence about her past. Lila knew that if he told Cameron, the life she had carefully built would collapse. She could no longer control her fate, and Randall held all the cards in his hands. After the meeting, Lila couldn't find peace. She felt like the world around her was closing in. She had no idea how she could gather such a large sum of money, and she had no desire to deal with Randall again. On the other hand, being exposed threatened to completely destroy her. Not just her marriage, but the social life she had carefully built. Lila began avoiding Cameron even more. She couldn't let him see her fear, her growing anxiety. But at night, her fears became real. She couldn't sleep, tormented by nightmares where Randall destroyed everything she loved. The situation worsened when Randall started showing up near their home. Lila noticed his car parked across the street a couple of times during the week. He didn't ring the doorbell or approach the house, but his presence was terrifying. Lila felt trapped, not knowing what to do. She knew that any move could be fatal, but delaying would only make things worse. Meanwhile, Randall continued to pressure Lila. He sent threatening messages, sometimes hinting that if she didn't give him the money, he would start telling Cameron the truth. One message was particularly chilling. "How do you think your husband will react when he finds out who you really were? How long will your perfect life last then?" Lila didn't know what to do. She started planning how to get the money to give Randall what he wanted. She had no other solution in mind. She felt completely trapped. By this point, Lila knew she couldn't wait any longer. She managed to gather a small sum, but it was only the beginning. She was haunted by the thought that if Randall found it insufficient, he could demand more, or worse, continue to blackmail her, breaking her life apart piece by piece. At one of their dinners, Lila tried to tell Cameron that she was feeling overwhelmed, blaming it on work and personal issues. Cameron, who had already started noticing strange behavior, offered his support, but Lila couldn't tell him the real reason for her fear. She was afraid that if she revealed the truth, his reaction would be worse than the consequences of Randall's blackmail. The tension kept rising. Lila received another message from Randall, demanding a meeting. He had become more aggressive, and his tone turned menacing. Lila knew she was in danger, emotionally and perhaps physically. She was prepared to meet him again, but this time she knew she had to be cautious. Randall had become too dangerous, and his demands were becoming unbearable. This was the beginning of the end for Lila. By early September, Cameron Lockwood felt as if the ground was slipping out from under him. In the last few weeks, Lila had grown so distant that even her presence in the house felt foreign. Dinners were quiet and tense, and the late-night conversations that used to bring them both joy had become rare. Cameron couldn't shake the feeling that Lila was hiding something, but by now it was more than just strange calls and her absences from home. His suspicions peaked one evening when he came home earlier than usual and saw a dark figure through the window. It was a man standing at the door. Though Cameron couldn't see his face, he felt a cold sweat run down his spine. He knew Lila wasn't expecting him so early. By the time he entered the house, the man was gone, but Lila seemed flustered. She quickly changed the subject, saying it was an old friend, and although Cameron outwardly pretended to believe her, inside he boiled with suspicion. It was Randall, and from that moment, Cameron's suspicions began spiraling into something far more dangerous: paranoia. Cameron started following Lila. He felt he couldn't trust her anymore, so whenever she said she was going to work or meeting friends, he followed her from a distance. One day he saw her meeting Randall in a supermarket parking lot. They exchanged a few quick words. Lila looked tense while Randall had a predatory air about him. Cameron saw her hand Randall an envelope, and his world crumbled. Immediately he concluded that Lila was cheating on him. He didn't know the details, had no solid proof, but the picture had already formed in his mind. That night, he couldn't sleep. For the first time in a long while, Cameron allowed himself to drink, hoping the alcohol would dull the pain and suppress the growing suspicions, but instead it only intensified his inner turmoil. Cameron started having nightmares. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of Lila leaving him, her deception, her betrayal with this mysterious man. He imagined them whispering behind his back, Randall taking her away while Cameron was left alone. These dreams tormented him, and his behavior became more erratic. He began to notice that even during the day, his mind played tricks on him. He saw shadows flickering in the corners of rooms, felt as if someone was watching him. With each passing day, his paranoia grew. Cameron began to suspect that Lila wasn't just cheating on him physically, but was hiding something much deeper. One night, after waking from another nightmare, he suddenly felt that Lila wasn't who she claimed to be. His mind began conjuring terrifying possibilities. Maybe she wasn't the woman he thought she was. Maybe her past was connected to something darker than he had ever imagined. By mid-September, Cameron had reached his breaking point. One evening, he sat in the kitchen, waiting for Lila to return home. In his hands was her phone, which she had accidentally left behind. Cameron had never violated her privacy before, but now he couldn't resist. A battle waged in his mind. He didn't want to do this, but fear and anger won out. His hands shook as he opened the message log. There were a few messages from Randall, most of them deleted, but one remained. "We need to talk about the next payment." Cameron felt his heart tighten. This confirmed his worst fears. Lila was involved in something secretive, and she was likely using their money for something illegal. A thought flashed through his mind that maybe Lila was tied to some kind of criminal activity. This added a new level of fear. What if she had put not only their marriage, but his safety at risk? That night, Cameron barely slept. He was losing touch with reality, increasingly unsure of where the truth ended and his own fantasies began. He began to feel like Lila was watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Her movements seemed more secretive, her gaze cold and distant. Every time she left the house, Cameron became obsessed with the idea that she was meeting Randall. His actions became more impulsive as he tried to regain control. At one point, he hacked into her email, hoping to find confirmation of his suspicions. But there was nothing concrete to indicate an affair. Instead, he found a few emails talking about her stress and anxiety, but offering no answers to the questions tormenting him. This only heightened his paranoia. Cameron decided that Lila was hiding far more than just a relationship with another man. Perhaps her past was linked to something much more dangerous. Amid all these doubts and suspicions, his behavior became more controlling. Cameron began checking her belongings, monitoring her every move, questioning every call and meeting. Lila tried to hide her feelings, but her fear became more apparent. She knew Cameron was beginning to notice her connection with Randall, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. She feared it would destroy their relationship and lead to catastrophe. On those nights when Cameron couldn't sleep, he would sit in the dark, watching Lila, and the darkest thoughts would surface in his mind. He began to think that Lila hadn't just betrayed him, she had used him. These thoughts dragged him into deep paranoia, and each day, he felt their relationship had become part of some dark game in which he was merely a pawn. Cameron Lockwood had been on the verge of a breakdown for several days. His paranoia, fears, and suspicions were intensifying with each minute. He was convinced that Lila had betrayed him, and his inner world was collapsing. He could no longer think rationally. His mind was consumed by madness, and he was rapidly losing touch with reality. During this time, Lila had been planning something completely different. She knew Cameron was suffering from mental health issues and was preparing to have a conversation in which she would reveal the whole truth. Lila had been planning for this moment for a long time. Her fear of being exposed was overshadowed by her love for Cameron, and she knew that living in lies was no longer an option. She was trapped emotionally between her past and her future with him. Lila hoped to tell him about her past in a safe and supportive setting, but Cameron's suspicion and emotional instability made it a difficult task. On this day, Lila was preparing to reveal the truth to Cameron. She knew it might be her last chance to save their marriage. Lila wrote a letter detailing everything: her struggles with her transition, her fears, Randall's blackmail, and her love for Cameron, which hadn't changed despite all the hardships. She hoped that, if the worst happened, this letter would help him understand her actions. Meanwhile, Randall increased the pressure. He knew Lila was preparing for something important and couldn't let her expose everything. Randall feared that the truth about his role in her past would surface and not only ruin her life, but jeopardize his own safety. That's why he decided Lila had to disappear. The idea of faking her death came to him suddenly. Randall saw that Lila could no longer control the situation with Cameron and realized that her disappearance was the only way to protect both her and himself. Cameron came home late that evening after a stressful day at work. The house was dark and something felt wrong. He called out for Lila, but there was nothing in response but eerie silence. His heart began to race as he climbed the stairs and entered the bedroom. There on the floor, he saw Lila's body. She lay motionless, and something that looked like blood surrounded her head. At that moment, Cameron felt his world completely collapse. His worst nightmare had come true. He rushed to her body, desperately trying to wake her, but Lila showed no signs of life. His screams echoed through the house. Cameron began to panic, unsure of what to do. His mind was consumed by panic and guilt. He couldn't believe this was really happening. What he didn't know was that this was all part of a carefully planned scheme. While Cameron was sinking into despair, Randall was in action. The plan was simple yet devious. He staged Lila's death to help her disappear from Cameron's life and escape the looming blackmail. Randall had been developing this plan for a long time, knowing it was the only way for Lila to escape all her problems. He used red liquid to create the illusion of a violent death and smuggled Lila out of the house while Cameron was at work. Lila agreed to this risky move. She realized that life with Cameron was no longer possible. His paranoia and mental instability had made her existence dangerous. But she also understood that if she didn't disappear now, Randall would continue to blackmail her and her life would crumble. After several days of chaos, the police were called to the scene and Lila was officially declared missing. Cameron became the prime suspect. The police found his traces at the murder scene, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to her death. Randall's contradictory statements, followed by his sudden disappearance, only made the case more confusing. A theory emerged that Cameron might have struck Lila fatally in a fit of rage, though the evidence was inconclusive. However, it appeared as though Lila was truly dead, and Randall used this as a cover for her escape. Cameron was arrested. He was charged with murder, even though he remembered nothing. His mind was completely broken. Deep down, he believed Lila was dead and considered himself guilty. His condition worsened with each passing day, filled with nightmares and hallucinations. He was convinced he had killed his wife in a fit of rage, though deep down he still hoped it had all been a vision. He couldn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The letter Lila had written was never found. It disappeared along with her, leaving Cameron without a chance to know the full truth. Lila, now under a new name and living in another country, began her life anew. She knew she had left behind ruined lives, but believed it was the only way to survive. Randall had helped her disappear, though now she could trust no one, not even him. The end of this story leaves many questions. Is Lila truly alive, or was this a carefully planned murder? Cameron remained in prison, tormented by guilt but left without clear answers. After Lila's presumed death and Cameron's arrest, he was sent to prison, but his mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Each day, he lost more and more connection with reality. In his cell while awaiting trial, reality and fantasy began to merge into one nightmarish chaos. Cameron no longer knew what to trust, and every detail of his life now seemed to him distorted, seen through a twisted lens. By early November, Cameron started noticing strange things around him. He heard voices at night, as if someone was whispering his name. Each time he woke up from these sounds, he was sure he saw Lila's silhouette in the corner of the room. Her face looked the same as before, but something in her eyes filled him with fear. These weren't just visions. Cameron began to believe Lila was somehow still alive and watching him. Every night she appeared in his dreams, standing next to the bed without saying a word. These nightmares became so vivid that upon waking, Cameron felt his mind unraveling under the weight of doubt. His paranoia grew, and he began to question not only whether Lila ever truly loved him, but whether their love had ever existed at all. Things took a darker turn when Cameron received an anonymous letter delivered to his prison cell. The letter had no signatures, just one sentence. "She was never on your side." Cameron's heart froze. Dark scenarios began playing out in his mind. He was convinced Lila and Randall had been working together from the beginning to ruin his life. They had used his trust, his love, to achieve their own twisted goals. He recalled all the small details that once seemed insignificant. How Lila avoided talking about her past, her secret meetings with Randall, her strange looks in the final days of their life together. All of this now fit into a larger conspiracy. Cameron was convinced he had become the victim of a complex game they had been playing behind his back. His mind couldn't shake the thought that all the events had been planned in advance, and that he had merely been a pawn in someone's sinister plot. By this time, Cameron was sinking deeper and deeper into his dark thoughts. He could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. It seemed to him that Randall had always been there, always pulling the strings, controlling his life, and making him do what Lila and Randall wanted. Cameron replayed the day he first saw them together, and now that moment had become the starting point of his downfall. Every time someone entered his cell, Cameron felt it could be anyone. Someone sent to finish Randall's work. Perhaps his accusation of Lila's murder was part of the plan. The police, the prison guards, even his lawyer. They all now seemed to Cameron like part of the conspiracy. His belief in reality had crumbled, and in every event, he saw proof that he had been deceived. One night, Cameron heard Lila's voice again. He got out of bed, struggling to navigate the darkness of the cell, and felt she was somewhere nearby. He wasn't sure anymore if she was dead. His entire being was consumed by paranoia. He began to think Lila had never died, and her death had only been part of her plan to disappear and start a new life with Randall. In his mind, her words from days before her disappearance echoed, "You'll never know the whole truth." These words were now like a curse haunting him. Cameron started keeping notes, trying to piece together the details of their life. He wrote about his suspicions. Every day Lila had acted strangely, every call, every look. It became clear from his notes that he could no longer distinguish his guesses from real events. He believed that if he pieced together all the fragments, he would understand how he had been betrayed and exact revenge. But with each passing day, this mosaic became more fragmented, as if reality itself was falling apart. Cameron's paranoia reached its peak. He was now certain that enemies surrounded him. He began refusing to speak with his lawyers, suspecting them of working for Randall. His entire life had turned into a game with reality, where he could trust no one, not even himself. His nightly visions became so real that he could no longer tell if he was dreaming or awake. Lila seemed to be with him every night, but always vanished. The night of November 17, 2012, was filled with tension and the cold silence that seemed to envelop Cameron Lockwood's home. Over the past few weeks, his paranoia, fear, and anger had reached their peak. He could no longer ignore Lila's strange calls, her secrecy, her meetings with Randall, and the constant nightmarish visions. It all seemed part of an evil conspiracy, deliberately designed to destroy his life. Cameron had been waiting for this evening, knowing that everything was heading toward a final showdown. That day, Lila had come home earlier than usual. She looked tired and defeated, as though an unsolvable battle was raging inside her. Cameron, distant and withdrawn, didn't take his eyes off her. To him, it seemed like every move she made was part of a well-thought-out plan. He noticed her frequently checking the time and glancing out the window as though expecting someone. This only fueled his suspicions, and in his mind, all thoughts narrowed down to one. She was waiting for Randall. Around 10 p.m., Cameron heard the sound of a car outside the window. It was exactly what he had feared. Randall had arrived at their home. At that moment, everything inside Cameron ignited with rage. He knew he couldn't take it any longer. His mind was flooded with images of betrayal he had constructed, and they pushed him to act. Randall calmly stepped out of the car, looking around cautiously. Cameron watched him from the bedroom window. He saw Lila open the door and whisper something, her face pale. That was the final straw for Cameron. He was convinced that their meeting was part of a conspiracy to destroy him once and for all. In his mind, Randall and Lila were now allies, working together to ruin his life. When Randall stepped into the house, Cameron was already standing at the threshold of the living room, his gaze filled with rage. He slowly approached Lila and Randall, never taking his eyes off them. Lila sensed something was wrong, and her heart sank. She knew this was a moment of truth, but she had no idea how far things had gone in her husband's mind. "You knew from the beginning," Cameron said, his voice quiet but full of hatred. "You both planned this?" Lila looked at him in confusion, her eyes filled with fear. She tried to explain, but Cameron interrupted her, not giving her a chance to speak. "It was all a lie. Our whole life. A deception. You were always with him, and I—" His voice trembled with fury. "I was just a pawn in your game." At that moment, Lila realized she could no longer hide the truth. She took a deep breath and, gathering all her courage, finally spoke. "Cameron, I should have told you everything earlier," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I tried, but I was afraid of how you'd react. I was afraid of losing you. You need to know that I—" But her words were cut off. Cameron could no longer hold back. All he heard wasn't an apology or an explanation, but another confirmation that Lila had betrayed him. His mind, distorted by paranoia, turned this moment into the climax of the conspiracy they had been weaving against him. He felt his anger engulf him completely, and in a fit of rage, he lunged at Lila. Randall tried to intervene. He grabbed Cameron by the shoulder, trying to hold him back, but it only fueled Cameron's fury. Cameron shoved Randall with such force that he nearly fell. In that moment, everything spiraled out of control. Cameron couldn't remember exactly how it happened, but his hands were around Lila's neck. Her eyes widened in terror as she realized he had lost control of himself. "You've ruined everything," Cameron whispered, his voice filled with madness and pain. "You've destroyed it all." Lila tried to break free, but his grip was too strong. In her final moments, she whispered, "I wanted to help." But her words faded, and her body went limp in Cameron's hands. Randall finally managed to intervene, but it was too late. Lila lay on the floor, lifeless. Cameron, as if coming out of a trance, looked at his hands, at Lila, and then at Randall. His mind was blank. He couldn't comprehend what he had just done. "What have you done?" Randall shouted, his voice filled with horror and shock. Cameron, without saying a word, slowly stepped away from Lila's body. In his mind, everything was a blur. Love, hatred, betrayal, and fear. That night for Cameron, Lockwood was like a fog. Everything he felt was clouded by a mixture of anger, fear, and the alcohol that had been coursing through his veins for hours. Before the confrontation, he had spent several hours alone with a bottle of whiskey. It was his usual escape from the inner pain and chaos that had consumed his mind in the past weeks. The alcohol dulled his thoughts but intensified his emotions. The fear of betrayal, the anger at Lila and Randall, who he believed had been deceiving him all along. As the argument reached its peak, Cameron could no longer control his actions. Lila tried to explain herself, but every gesture and word only fueled his anger. Under the influence of alcohol, he was losing self-control by the second, and when Lila took a step toward him, something inside him snapped. Cameron's hands clenched into fists, and his mind could no longer perceive reality clearly. In that moment, consumed by pure rage, Cameron struck Lila across the face with such force that she fell to the floor. Her head hit the edge of the table, and the sound of the impact echoed through the room. Lila didn't scream, didn't make a sound. She lay motionless, and a chilling silence filled the room. Cameron, stumbling, took a step back, not fully understanding what had happened. To him, it seemed like just another scene from his twisted, alcohol-fueled fantasies. Randall, who had been standing in the corner of the room in the stunned silence, realized the gravity of the situation. He knew Cameron didn't mean to kill her, but now it didn't matter. Cameron had done the irreversible. Cameron, still in shock, stared at Lila's body lying before him. Her hair was spread across the floor, and a dark pool of blood was slowly forming around her head. That was what finally snapped him out of his trance. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking, trying to wake her, calling her name. "Lila, wake up, please." His voice was weak and trembling with fear. But Lila didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, and there was no breath. Cameron tried to find a pulse, but there was nothing. In that moment, pure terror overtook him. He realized what he had done. This wasn't just an accident, it was the result of his pent-up rage and the alcohol that had completely clouded his mind. He had killed her, the woman he had once loved more than life. Randall, realizing what had happened, knew he couldn't afford to be involved in this. He took a few steps back, then quickly turned and left the room, heading for the door. Cameron, lost in his shock, didn't even notice Randall's disappearance. He was completely focused on Lila and his fatal mistake. He couldn't believe she was dead. In his mind, it still felt like a nightmare from which he would soon wake up. Randall, leaving the house in a hurry, understood that his presence at the crime scene could become his downfall. He knew too much, and his involvement could lead to catastrophe. In that moment, his only solution was to flee. Leaving Cameron alone with his crime, Cameron began to panic. His hands were trembling, his heart was racing. He knew he had committed a crime but didn't know what to do next. His thoughts were chaotic and confused. Images of Lila flashed in his mind, the woman he had once loved and the woman he had just killed. He couldn't stay in that house any longer. Overwhelmed by terror and the fear of what was to come, Cameron fled the house, leaving Lila's body on the living room floor. He ran outside, got into his car, and drove away, not knowing where he was going. The only thought pulsing through his mind was that he needed to escape, as far away as possible from this place, from his mistake, from the reality that had caught up with him. The next day after the tragedy, the quiet morning light filled the street where Lila and Cameron's house stood. But inside the house, a grim silence still prevailed. No one noticed that something was wrong until their neighbor, Joseph Harrison, an elderly man who lived across the street, sensed something was off. The Lockwood house had always been lively. Cameron's car was often parked out front, and Lila was always on the move, leaving for errands or meeting with someone. But that morning, everything seemed strangely still. Joseph decided to take a closer look. He noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, which was completely out of character for Lila. Joseph called out several times, but there was no response. A growing sense of unease took over him, and with shaking hands, he reached for the phone to call the police. When the police arrived at the scene, they immediately felt that something was wrong. There were muddy footprints on the porch, as if someone had rushed out in a hurry. When the officers entered the house, they were met with a horrifying sight. Lila lay in the living room, her body still, and the blood around her head had already dried. One of the officers, visibly shaken, quickly called for investigators. The investigation began. Detectives carefully examined the house, and it soon became clear that a struggle had occurred. Cameron Lockwood had disappeared, and his car was not in the garage. Suspicion immediately fell on him. There were no signs of forced entry, and all of Lila's personal belongings were in place. This wasn't a random break-in. It was a tragedy that unfolded between people who knew each other. Detectives started interviewing the neighbors, trying to piece together a timeline of events. Joseph Harrison told the police about the strange silence and Cameron's behavior in recent weeks. But the most significant clue came from Lila's phone and laptop, which the police found on the kitchen table. The next day, the police began going through the contents of Lila's phone and laptop. They quickly discovered conversations with someone named Randall Smith. These messages not only revealed Lila's fears about her past, but also her deep anxiety regarding Cameron. The messages were filled with tension and fear, as if Lila was on the verge of being exposed. The officers read how Lila had told Randall about her intention to finally tell Cameron the truth, but she was terrified it could end in disaster. These messages became key to the investigation, and the police immediately began searching for Randall Smith. They were concerned that Randall had also disappeared and remained unreachable, further fueling suspicion that he was somehow involved. By this time, Cameron had been on the run for 3 days. He left Indianapolis immediately after the tragedy, heading west, trying to hide. His mind was in turmoil, guilt, fear of punishment, and inner conflict. He couldn't believe he had killed his wife. Images of Lila standing before him, with the same expression he had seen at the moment of her death, kept flashing in his mind. It seemed to him that her voice still haunted him. Cameron lived in fear and barely ate, moving from place to place, staying in cheap motels. However, the guilt and panic wouldn't let him go. Every night he woke up in a cold sweat, seeing her face before him. He couldn't run any longer, but he was terrified of what awaited him if he surrendered. The Indianapolis police intensified their search for Cameron. He was declared a fugitive nationwide, and his photos appeared in the news. However, he remained elusive, moving through small towns, trying to stay out of sight. But his condition worsened, and he knew he couldn't last much longer. Meanwhile, investigators continued to explore the connections between Lila, Cameron, and Randall. Everything pointed to Randall as a key figure in Lila's life, but his role in the tragedy remained a mystery. The police couldn't determine whether he was an accomplice or just a witness. With each new discovery, the story became darker. Unable to bear the pressure any longer, Cameron finally made a decision. He knew he couldn't hide forever. The guilt over the murder weighed too heavily on him, and he couldn't live with it any longer. On the morning of November 24th, Cameron walked into a police station in a small town on the West Coast and turned himself in. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He offered no resistance when they arrested him. "I killed her," he whispered as they led him to the interrogation room. Those words sounded like a final judgment for Cameron. In June 2013, the case of Cameron Lockwood dominated headlines across the country. Following his confession to Lila's murder, the trial was anticipated with intense media attention, drawing the public's eye and the LGBTQ+ community's focus. This wasn't just a trial for a murderer, it was a case that touched on betrayal, love, personal identity, and the right to one's truth. Cameron, who had sunk into a deep depression after his arrest, claimed he had acted in a fit of passion. His lawyers built their defense around the argument that he had been unable to cope with the shock of Lila's sudden revelation about her past, which he perceived as a betrayal. According to the defense, Cameron was on the verge of a mental breakdown when he discovered the truth, and his actions that fateful night were driven by emotional turmoil. On the day of the trial's opening, reporters, journalists, and activists filled the courtroom, eager to witness the proceedings. The prosecution quickly presented its case. They argued that the murder was premeditated and brutal. The prosecutor claimed that Cameron had been aware for weeks that Lila was hiding something, and his anger had been building. They argued that Cameron acted not in a moment of passion, but in a state of controlled rage that finally erupted during their last confrontation. The prosecution's main argument was that Cameron didn't immediately grasp the severity of the situation after the blow. They used his flight from the scene as evidence that he consciously chose not to seek help, but to flee, indicating intent. The lead investigator presented all the evidence gathered from the house. Lila's messages with Randall, signs of a struggle, and the blood on the living room floor, along with witness testimonies that placed Cameron leaving the house on the night of the murder. The trial also brought to light one of the most painful issues for the LGBTQ+ community, the right to privacy around one's identity and the battle against prejudice. Lila's story, her fight for the right to be herself, became a central topic in the media. Journalists delved into her life before she met Cameron, her transition, and her fear that revealing the truth would shatter her new life. These articles sparked a wide range of reactions in society. Some supported Lila's right to keep her past private, while others argued that such secrets should not exist in a marriage. Public reaction to the case became another point of tension in court. Prosecutors emphasized that Lila wasn't simply a victim of deceit, but someone trying to protect her identity and life. From their perspective, Lila's fear of Cameron's reaction was well-founded. He had shown signs of instability and aggression, which ultimately led to her tragic death. Witness testimonies played a key role in the trial. The prosecution brought in psychological experts who explained that Cameron's actions couldn't be explained by a temporary emotional breakdown alone. According to the psychologists, he had exhibited deep-seated paranoia and aggression that surfaced long before the tragedy. They presented Cameron's messages to a friend, where he expressed feelings of betrayal and humiliation. Meanwhile, the defense argued that Lila had knowingly hidden her truth, provoking Cameron's uncontrolled reaction. Cameron's attorneys called on experts who spoke about his emotional state in the months leading up to the murder. They claimed that Lila had played on his fears and insecurities, slowly pushing him toward a mental collapse. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak when a recording of Lila's conversations with Randall was played, revealing her anxiety and fear. In one message, Lila confided in Randall that she was still terrified of Cameron's reaction and didn't know how to tell him the truth. This message became her final cry for help, one that went unheard until the tragedy. The prosecution used this to argue that Lila wasn't a manipulator, but simply a woman trying to find a way out of a difficult situation. Psychologists called by the prosecution explained that Lila feared the stigma and judgment that could follow if her transgender status were revealed. By the end of December 2013, Cameron Lockwood's trial was coming to a close. For months, the public had followed the high-profile case, and each new twist triggered widespread media discussions. But the moment finally came when the judge was to deliver the verdict. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and the families of both Cameron and Lila. The atmosphere was tense. Cameron looked exhausted, his face pale, his eyes cast downward. Everyone awaited the decision that would determine his fate. The judge announced the verdict. Cameron was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The defense had succeeded in avoiding a conviction for premeditated murder, which resulted in a more lenient sentence. However, no explanation could bring Lila back, and her family was still grieving the loss of their beloved. Cameron was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years for good behavior. The sentence was both harsh and lenient for a man who, in a moment of rage, had made a fatal mistake. Following the sentencing, Lila's family began work on creating a foundation in her honor. Their grief turned into activism. They dedicated their efforts to fighting for the rights of transgender people. The Layla Street Claire Foundation became a platform for providing support and aid to transgender individuals facing discrimination and violence. Layla's family ensured that her name would become a symbol of the fight for rights and freedom of identity. Over the years, the foundation became an influential force in the LGBTQ+ rights movement, helping hundreds of people who faced similar struggles. Layla, who had once feared telling her story, became a symbol for those forced to hide their true selves out of fear of judgment. Randall Smith, the mysterious figure from Layla's past, had disappeared completely by this time. Investigators were unable to track him down, despite efforts to question him and uncover his role in the events leading to the tragedy. Randall remained a ghost, vanishing after Layla's death, and his actions were never subjected to legal scrutiny. Officially, he bore no responsibility for what had happened, and he remained unknown to the public. Still, his role in the tragedy continued to raise questions. Some suspected that he had used Layla for his own purposes, but no evidence of this was ever found. To many, he remained an enigmatic figure who likely knew more than what was revealed in court. 3 years passed since Cameron Lockwood's sentencing. In that time, he experienced many changes. Prison life was torturous for him, not only physically but mentally. Long days spent in solitary reflection forced him to confront the fears and insecurities that led to that fatal night. After several months of depression, Cameron was sent to undergo psychotherapy. Initially, he resisted help, convincing himself that he didn't need to talk to therapists. However, the tension inside him grew, and bouts of paranoia and fear returned, forcing him to reconsider his actions and their causes. Eventually, realizing that he couldn't move forward without it, Cameron agreed to therapy. During the sessions, Cameron faced uncomfortable truths. The therapist helped him unpack the anger that had built up inside him for years. Cameron came to realize that his reaction to Layla's secret wasn't just about betrayal. It was a manifestation of deeply ingrained toxic masculinity. He had grown up believing that male strength was tied to control and an absence of weakness. Any deviation from this was seen as a threat to his status and identity. Layla's secret had shattered his worldview, but through therapy, Cameron began to understand that it wasn't just about Layla. It was also about his inability to accept things that fell outside of his narrow understanding of normal. He realized that his reaction to her past was driven not by the truth itself, but by his fear of being betrayed, losing control, and becoming vulnerable. With each year, Cameron delved deeper into how his own issues led to the tragedy. As he reflected, he recalled moments from their life together, times when Lila had tried to explain or hint that she had a past she feared revealing. He began to understand that his inability to listen to her or accept her for who she was had been the real cause of their broken relationship. Cameron sought to come to terms with himself, recognizing that his guilt lay not just in the act of killing, but in his failure to support Lila when she needed acceptance the most. By this time, Cameron had become a different person. Therapy gave him the tools to view his life from a new perspective. He started participating in prison mental health support programs and even helped other inmates struggling with anger and inner conflict. He managed to express his regrets in letters to Lila's family, though he never received a response. Meanwhile, Lila's family continued their work with the LGBTQ+ community through the foundation named in her honor. Each year, they held events dedicated to fighting for transgender rights and combating discrimination. Lila's story became a symbol of acceptance and the fight for the right to personal identity, inspiring many people worldwide. The foundation grew, gaining national recognition, and became a powerful platform for those suffering from prejudice and the fear of revealing their truth. Years later, Cameron continued his therapy, aware that his path to healing was only just beginning. He now understood that his actions that night were not just caused by external circumstances, but by his inner fears and unresolved issues. He continued to learn how to accept himself and his weaknesses, hoping that one day he could truly atone for his guilt. Cameron and Lila's story remained one of the most discussed in the media for years. It left an indelible mark, reminding people of the importance of honesty, acceptance, and the fight against toxic masculinity and societal prejudice. One evening, as he looked at his reflection in the mirror of his cell, he thought he saw Lila's figure behind him. He turned around, but no one was there. This scene repeated itself over and over, convincing him that Lila was watching him from the shadows. His mind told him she was close, waiting for the moment to destroy him completely. By late November, Cameron had completely lost touch with reality. He no longer trusted his own mind, but was sure of one thing. Lila and Randall had been playing him from the start. Their relationship was a lie, their marriage a facade, and his life a part of the intricate game they had played behind his back. In his mind, there was no doubt. He was the victim, used and betrayed. And now, with everything laid bare, he realized he had only been a pawn in their cruel game. The psychologist working with him in prison tried to understand the depth of his mental breakdown, but Cameron had shut himself off. He could no longer trust anyone and believed the truth was buried too deep.
Welcome to Real Crime Family, your ultimate destination for gripping true crime documentaries. Explore real-life mysteries, criminal investigations, and shocking stories from around the world. Our channel covers notorious cases, unsolved crimes, and in-depth analysis of the criminal mind. Each documentary is carefully crafted to provide a realistic, engaging, and thought-provoking look at the world of true crime. Subscribe and join us as we explore the dark side of human nature, the justice system, and the detectives who search for the truth. New episodes every night.